Well, you see too that often people who are tried by fire discover the deepest association with meaning precisely under those conditions. And that is analogous to the vision of the crucifix, let's say, that you have to go deep into the darkness and perhaps hopefully voluntarily before you can see the brightest of all possible lights. And so this idea that part of the problem is if you provide your children with everything, which you could do as a wealthy parent, let's say, you deprive them of deprivation, you deprive them of adventure, you deprive them of destiny, and you remove from them the necessity of grappling in a manner that really does make life meaningful. One of the things that I've really noticed in my tours, this has been extremely interesting and heartening, is that whenever I talk about the nexus between responsibility and meaning, the audiences always go dead silent. They're pretty silent during most of the discussions, but that particularly brings a hush to everyone because it's not a message that people are receiving anymore. It's like, okay, life is suffering and malevolence in its essence, in some undeniable sense. It may not be only that, but it is undeniably also that. And so you need a sustaining meaning to tide you over while you're suffering and while you're betrayed. And then the question is, well, where's the most reliable place to find that meaning? And one answer is, well, hedonism, and another answer might be cynicism and anarchism and that sort of wild life that goes along with throwing off all constraints. And there's some attraction to that. But more fundamentally, if you watch how people actually respond in times of crisis, they find that the responsibilities that they've undertaken in the past to form friendships, to form intimate relationships, to clean up their family and establish tight bonds, to take on some major burden and make sacrifices in their life, that's where they get all the meaning. Hedonism doesn't work technically. Like we looked at the effect of positive emotion on decision making. Okay, so to pursue hedonism is to suppress negative emotion, let's say, but also to pursue positive emotion. And those can be technically differentiated neurologically and psychologically, conceptually. They're completely separate systems. They're mutually inhibitory. They run on different biochemical pathways. What happens when you're hedonically, when you're in the midst of a hedonic experience? And the answer is, you get short-term and impulsive. And a lot of the pure operation of the hedonic system is short-term impulsivity. And so the pathology of hedonism, technically, is mania. And it's the counterpart to depression, let's say. And manic people, they want to do everything at once and they're unbelievably impulsive. And so they can't make good decisions. And you might say, well, if your philosophy is hedonic, then whatever makes you happiest is a good decision. But then you see pathologies of hedonism that produce impulsivity. And the way out of that is to recognize that it's sacrifice that's the right replacement for hedonism. Because you might say, well, I should be self-centered. We talked about this earlier. It's like, well, do you mean the self that is going to drink a quart of vodka tonight and then be hungover tomorrow? Or do you mean the self that's going to sustain itself wisely and carefully over a 40-year period, let's say in a properly sustaining marriage? And so it isn't even hedonism, it's narrow, impulsive, immature, 2-year-old hedonism. And that is not a solution.
This is why there are no convincing movies about heaven, because our hedonism has generated this notion of heaven as supernatural hedonic pleasure. Whether it's the beatific vision or music or golden streets or whatever, we're bored by that. That's not it. We don't know what it is, but that's certainly not what it is. Problem of boredom goes deeper than we think.
Well, in Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky nails this too, because he says, and it's so brilliant, he's criticizing the Palace of Crystal, which was a building built in the UK for the World's Fair, and it was the first modernist building, and it was this image of technological utopia and material plenty, which the Marxists push as well. And Dostoevsky said, What's wrong with this materialist utopian vision? And he says it so brilliantly with his bitter and cynical character. He says, if you set up human beings so they had nothing to do but lie around in warm pools of water and busy themselves with the propagation of the race and eat cakes non-stop, so the land of milk and honey in the narrowest possible sense, the first thing that we would do is set about the place smashing it up just so something unpredictable could happen so that we would have our adventure. And I read that and I thought, man, that's so deadly right, is that he said human beings are ungrateful and we can curse. It's the primary thing that separates us from animals. And that it's related to the idea of eating the fruit in the garden of paradise, is that we are made for a challenge. We are made for an adventure. We're not made for this kind of narrow and local hedonism. It's demeaning and it's counterproductive. And it isn't rich in the face of tragedy and malevolence. It's a bad solution.
Positive emotion is associated with movement forward. Like if you're where you want to be and things are going well, then your behavior should be activated so that you go and get things. Now, one of the negative consequences of that is that if you're really in a good mood, really happy, you're going to be impulsive and make mistakes. You know, because you hear these dough-headed, that's a very minor word, people who are always pushing happiness as the key measure for successful existence. It's so ill-informed that it's embarrassing that even happens. Positive emotion makes people impulsive. Maniacs, for example, which is really, that's mania, right? Bipolar disorder. If you're manic, you're one happy person. Way too happy. Everything is great. Nothing but wonderful things that are beyond your imagination are going to happen to you, and they're going to happen fast. And so you're down to the mall to buy everything you can possibly get your hands on because you have 100 uses for everything. And then a week later, you know, you crash into your depressive episode and you realize that you're $150,000 in debt and you've alienated everyone that you know. It's like, that's untrammeled positive emotion. So how about no? A pure index of positive emotion is no way of determining whether or not a system is working properly, even your own system. You need a balance between positive and negative emotions. Plus, positive emotions are absolutely exhausting, because if you're in a manic episode, it's like, it's time to get everything good right now. Fine, but you won't sleep for a week and then you die because you just burned yourself to a crisp. And so to be overwhelmingly enthusiastic about everything sounds like a real blast, and I've seen full-blown manics and they're having plenty of fun, but it is not a pleasant thing to behold. They're just all over the place, and you know, yeah, it's really not good. It's really not good. You need a balance between these two systems, because the whole world isn't explored territory bursting with nothing but promise. That's not the world. The world is that in a bounded space, a little bit, with an absolute horror show going out around the periphery. And both systems need to be active in order to keep you balanced. People do, unfortunately, sustain damage sometimes to the left prefrontal cortex, responsible for positive emotion, or the right prefrontal cortex, responsible for negative emotion. And if you sustain right hemisphere prefrontal damage, it makes you inappropriately happy and impulsive, and your life just goes, you just spiral downhill, because you make nothing but impulsive decisions. And you know what the real world consequence of that is? You know, you get drunk and be impulsive for one night, you can learn what the bloody consequences of that are. You try living like that for a month, independently of IQ. That's the other thing that's so interesting. You can blow out your left prefrontal cortex and not suffer much of a decrease, especially in crystallized intelligence. Positive emotion is going to auger you right into the ground. And then if you're perhaps even more unlucky and you lose the left prefrontal cortex, then you're permanently depressed, because there's nothing but the unexplored manifesting itself. We know that if you take depressed people and you do EEG analysis, that they have predominant resting right hemisphere EEG activation. And so that's roughly, so why is this? Well, unknown territory, known territory. You think, well, is that real? Well, it's real enough, so that's how your brain evolved. That seems pretty damn real. enthusiasm and joy, happiness, let's say, is 100% dependent, as far as we can tell, on observations that you're progressing towards a valued goal. It's not attainment focused, that's satiation. You get something you want and you're satisfied about it. That's a whole different neurochemical system. But enthusiasm and joy that people associate with happiness manifests itself when you're moving towards a valued goal. So if you don't prioritize your goals because you don't exist within a structure of value, then you have no positive emotion. And positive emotion is half of forward moving motivation. Well, in fact, in terms of forward movement, it's almost all the motivation, because the embodied manifestation of positive emotion is the movement towards a valued goal. That's what it is. That's why you have the positive emotion, because you are a creature that can move towards goals. And the emotional signaling of that is positive emotion. No goal, no positive emotion. No hierarchy of goals, dilution or eradication of positive emotion. Because if you're confused enough and you have 100 goals and you can't prioritize them, then every goal has 1% of the significance necessary to really move you forward. And so to be maximally motivated, you need to know why you're doing what you're doing, all the way up Jacob's ladder, all the way up. And that brings us to the notion of the macrocosm that's the heavenly hierarchy. And in some sense, it's a psychological macrocosm, although not in all senses, because it brings society into the purview. So here's a proposition. Any system of priorities is a structure of values. So you may or may not accept the proposition that you have to hierarchically arrange your perceptions. You also, by the way, have to do the same thing on the action front. Because if you're inclined to do 10 things at once, you can do none. And consciousness, by the way, is a very narrow channel. And we generally can only concentrate on one thing at a time. And the reason for that, in some sense, is because we can only act out one thing at a time. And so not only do you have to prioritize your perceptions, which are action-based anyways, you also have to prioritize what you're going to do, because you have to do the first thing first, and then the second thing, and the third thing, and that's obviously a structure of priority. And a structure of priority is a structure of comparative value, and a hierarchical structure of comparative value is an ethic. And so what that means, as far as I can tell, and this is something, if it's true, is that we cannot see the world except through an ethic. And I mean that literally as well as metaphorically. You literally cannot see the world or act in it. You cannot perceive the world except through a structure, a hierarchical structure of value, which is an ethic. And so then I would say, and here's something else to chew on for like 20 years, a story is a verbal description of a hierarchy of perceptual and action prioritization. And the reason that we're so attracted to stories is because it's so difficult to perceive and act in the world that we're hungry at the level of soul for a narrative that represents to us a hierarchical ethos that we could embody as a model for emulation. And so that's what our stories are. They're models, they're ritual models for emulation, most fundamentally. And the anti-hero story, well, that's easy enough to contend with. It's like, watch this person who ends up in catastrophe and hell and do the opposite of whatever it is they're doing. And so that's a powerful lesson, because there's something very compelling, as we said before, about very powerful negative emotion. And so even if you don't believe in heaven, you might be able to conjure up a belief in hell. And if you can't, I would say, well, you're either not using your imagination, or you're hiding, or so far you're just lucky. But I wouldn't expect that to last. And so you can certainly see the catastrophe, and even the hellish catastrophe, beckoning. And you might think, plotting a route that would make that the least likely seems to be a good idea. And so part of the reason that we're fascinated by villains and supervillains, for that example, or part of the reason we're fascinated and endlessly so with figures like Lucifer and Satan, is because we're attempting to flesh out the nature of the antithesis to the worst kind of hierarchy of values. And that's gripping to us. It's gripping to us. Now, there's more to it as well, because we also will turn our attention to the negative to fortify ourselves against the negative in preparation for confrontation with the negative. And so we can do that through use of fiction. And that's what we're doing, for example, at least in part, when we do such strange things as amuse ourselves with horror films. And so, any system of priorities is a structure of values. That's an ethic. It's hierarchical because one thing has to be put before many things, and things have to be done in sequence, and everything has to proceed in some sense in an intelligible manner towards the highest possible goal. And the alternative to that is not only the radical unhappiness that I already described, which is the destruction of any possibility of enthusiastic engagement with life in a meaningful sense on the positive front, but the other price you pay for being confused about your ethic is anxiety, most particularly anxiety, because anxiety is actually a signal of entropy in perception and action. If you don't know what you're doing, you don't know where you are, and you don't know where you're going. And if you're in a place where you don't know where you are or where you're going, you're in danger, because that's unmapped territory, and God only knows what lurks in unmapped territory. And you can think about that biologically. If you're somewhere you don't understand and you don't know where you're going, well, there's always the possibility of predation. But you can think about it metaphysically too, and that's worthwhile. If you're so confused and disoriented that you don't know where you are or where you're going, there are predators of the spirit who are much worse than snakes that are waiting in wait for you. And the probability that you'll move from aimless, hopeless, joyless anxiety to nihilism, corrosive bitterness, and genocidal fantasy in the fundamental extreme is very high. And so that's possession by a predator of the spirit in the desert of the soul. And that's real. So a system of priorities is a structure of values, an ethic. A narrative, and that would include a drama, is the description of a structure of values or an ethic or a set of priorities. We see and act out the world through what, when described, is a narrative. Now that's interesting. That's an interest. If that's true, it's very interesting. It's interesting partly because, you know, the postmodernists, who I don't admire generally speaking, they figured this out. They figured out that we likely see the world through a story. And that might even be true for scientists, is that a scientist, and Carl Jung believed this too, by the way, is that science takes place within a surrounding narrative. Now, what the postmodernists did, the French postmodernists in particular, and then the Americans through Yale most particularly, they leapt from problem, which was how do we perceive, solution, we see the world through a narrative, to narrow solution, which is that we prioritize our perceptions and our actions by imposing a narrative of power and dominance. And they swiped that from the Marxists. And that is simply not true. There is no evidence for that. Animals don't even do that in their social communities, or when they do it, they erect unstable and extremely violent social hierarchies. There's no evidence whatsoever that hierarchies predicated on a narrative of power function productively, even for the people that impose the narrative of power. One question might be, well, what do you mean to be a good person? And of course, that's the problem of the logos. And the answer to that would be something like, well, I want to be the proper mediator between possibility and actuality such that the best possible actuality can be manifested by the possibility that I confront. And every bloody thing you do, everything you see, is either nested in a unified hierarchy like that, or it's not. So let's say, what happens if it's not? Well, we actually know what happens if it's not. And let's say you're not unified psychologically in your value orientation. Okay, what's the consequence? Well, entropy. That's the first consequence. It's like, are you doing one thing, which you know what you're doing and can commit yourself to and can actually undertake, or are you so confused that you need to do 15 things at the same time, and you don't know which of them is most important? And the importance, by the way, is diluted by the multiplicity, right? Because if you pick something out as singularly important, you actually elevate it as important. If 15 things all of a sudden become equally important, they're all 1/15th as important, because if they weren't, you wouldn't have a problem sequencing them, and that means they're not motivating. So one of the consequences of that is that there's no positive emotion.
I've been embroiled in a lot of conflict, and I really don't like conflict. And I think the reason that I've been embroiled in so much is because I won't delay it. Like if there's an issue at hand, I want to address it right now. And the reason for that isn't that I enjoy it. In fact, I don't enjoy it at all. But what I really don't enjoy is prolonged conflict that never goes anywhere and that never ends.
Yeah.
And so
conflict delayed is conflict amplified, right?
Exactly
It just grows on you. Yes.
Exactly that. And that's one of the oldest stories that people have been telling each other forever, is that ignored things grow in the darkness outside the city until they become monstrous and break down the walls. And so you think, well, I'm afraid of listening, I'm afraid of hearing the problems. And that's fair enough. It's no wonder you're afraid. But you're nowhere near afraid enough of not doing that, because that's a bloody catastrophe. That'll be a bomb that'll go off in 10 years and blow up your marriage. You'll find out that your wife had an affair because, well, for her own reasons and because you didn't pay any attention to her for like 15 years. And then you think, well, I was afraid to pay attention, and yeah, fair enough. But now look where you are. You're in hell, and that's just not an improvement. So, you know, there's problems of various size out there in the world. And the largest problems are the apocalyptic problems that you just described, right? And it isn't even obvious which of those apocalyptic problems are real. But we could say, well, there's always the possibility that large-scale systems will come to a precipitous collapse. And we have to live with that. That's true in our own lives. We could die at any moment. So could the people we love. Like our cultures can fall apart. The apocalyptic terror is always beckoning as a possibility. Okay, now the question is that your problem? Now the answer...
Can you do anything about it,
well,
right?
The answer is your own nervous system will tell you that. Because imagine that imagine you're facing a problem that's so big that it paralyzes you and it turns you into a tyrant. Okay, that's too big a problem for you, obviously. And what you have to do is you have to scale back the problem until you find a dragon that's a size that you're willing to contend with, that you'll actually contend with. And so, you know, maybe you shouldn't be addressing the large-scale political problems of the world because your own house is a bloody catastrophe. And you watch the news and it paralyzes you and turns you into a ranting tyrant, and that means you're not the man for that job. You have to scale back. And maybe if you scale back and practiced straightening things up at the local level, which isn't trivial or easy, you get better and better at it, and then you could face larger and larger catastrophes and practically and productively, right? Instead of virtue signaling and going astray. You know, you do this in therapy. Is if someone is having a hard time making friends, you break that down into micro steps. And one thing you might have to do, as we discussed, is you might have to teach the person to introduce themselves. You know, and their problem is, I don't have any friends. It's like, no, your problem is you don't know how to shake hands and look someone in the eye. Right? And then you might say, well, can you do that? And they might say, well, I'm afraid to shake hands. It's like, well, can you look at me? Can you stretch out your hand? You know, can you touch my hand? I mean, this might sound trivial, but lots of people are paralyzed with social anxiety. And they have no idea how to shake hands. Yeah. And that just stops them cold, right? Because if you can't introduce yourself, how the hell are you going to make friends? If you run, then the signal that the story you're acting out is that the thing you're running from is bigger than you and that you have to hide. And that's just a recipe for anxiety. Now, it's not necessarily that easy to turn and face something, but you do detail out a variety of strategies in your books that might help people do that. You can differentiate the problem. Like you might have been traumatized at work, let's say, or let's not use that sort of jargony phraseology. You may be having tremendous difficulties at work. You might be dealing with people who are tyrannical at work and find it very meaningless. And that's bothering you constantly. It's disturbing your sleep, for example, and it's haunting you. And you tend to try to push it out of your mind when the thoughts come. And partly that's because the thought of getting a new job is so daunting that you can't face it. And one of the ways of recalibrating that is to break down the problem into small and manageable steps. And so, for example, one of the things that you can do if you might have to consider getting a new job because you're unhappy and miserable at work is open up your resume or your CV and look at it, right? So you might not be able to get a new job, but you might be able to open up your resume and look at it. And then having done that, you've sort of cracked the surface, and then maybe you could spend an hour a week for a month updating it, or 10 minutes a day, or 10 minutes every 2 days, something like that. But part of the trick is to take these larger monsters that are frightening enough so you want to run away from them, decide that you're going to face the situation. You lay out, for example, in your book, you ask people a lot of different questions about what they're thinking. And if something is making you anxious and afraid and miserable, it's very useful to write out all the reasons it's making you anxious and miserable, and to ask yourself, what is it you're afraid of? And then to develop a differentiated plan for dealing with those. So here's a very useful thing the psychoanalysts learn to do. So imagine you do go to a social occasion and you find as you enter the hall, you're getting nervous and sweaty. Now, if you watch, this is why Carl Jung, for example, believed that we lived through a dream. We lived life through a dream. So, and that's a story. And so what you'll see is that if you feel that nervousness and you attend to it, a little drama will run in your head in images. You know, and it'll be something like, well, I'm going to go in here and no one's going to talk to me. And this will happen in pictures, like a little movie. No one's going to talk to me, and I'm going to end up in the corner, and I'm going to be bored, and I'm going to be sweaty and hot, and it's going to be real uncomfortable. And it's just like this other time when I went to this social occasion and this terrible thing happened, and the whole drama will play out in your head. And then you think, oh, that's the problem. And then, well, then maybe you have someone to talk to about that fantasy. Or maybe because now you have the fantasy in front of you and you looked at it, you can think, well, wait a minute. As you said, wait a minute, wait a second. It isn't like that other situation. My friends are here. I can go talk to John. I know him real well. We'll just have a conversation. I can go sit at a table and with one of my friends and spend most of the time there. I can be with my wife. But what'll happen is we get nervous, and that fantasy will make itself manifest, but you don't want to face it, and that's when you rush to a premature solution. You shut it off.
Right.
Yeah, so what you're doing there is you're failing to allow the anxiety-ridden fantasy to make itself manifest. And you do that because you don't want to know where you're vulnerable, right? And no wonder, like, who the hell wants to know where they're vulnerable? But the answer to that is, well, someone who wants to fix it. Because you're not going to fix it.
I do. Yeah, I do. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
And now I've come to, I love looking for those vulnerabilities, and I love a good community, and I love the discourse. I love my friends who will point them out and say, hey, here's a blind spot, which is why, again, circling back, it's why we have to have other people in our life. Now, if done in the right spirit, I love, that's the whole scientific process, right? Rejecting the no, like, I wasn't wrong, right? Like, the whole idea is, let's be a little bit less wrong, right? So I think there's
yeah, that's right. That's the whole idea. That's humility, man, is to be a little bit less wrong. And Jesus, that's what a deal.
But what a fun way to live. It's such an easier way to live than I have to be right. That is an exhausting grip on your life. It's a choking grip on your life, instead of, I want to be a little bit less wrong, and I begin to seek out places where I might be wrong. That's just taking the blade and trying to sharpen it as finely as possible.
It might be very disheartening to see at what small scale you have to begin improvements, right? But the truth of the matter is that tends to scale exponentially. Is once you start making improvements, the improvements feed back upon themselves. And so even if you have to start out small, it doesn't take very long before you're on the upward trajectory, and it's not linear. You know, you can fail precipitously, right? But you can also succeed precipitously. Once you get the ball rolling, positive things tend to aggregate together, and you can make a lot of progress even if you start from a pretty damn dismal place. Responsibility in some sense, that's maturity, but I would also say that's the adventure of your life. And how is that tied to the idea of sacrifice? Well, what do you have to sacrifice if you're responsible? And the answer is you have to sacrifice your short-term hedonic and immature whims, right? So if you're a child, if you're 2, you're impulsive, and that means that you only act for the moment, and you only act in relationship to what it is that you as a singular individual want in that moment. And that's just not a tenable solution to the complexities of life, because you don't just exist in a moment. You exist as an iterated set of identities across time. You yourself are a community that extends across time, and you have to govern every action that you take in the present in relationship to the fact that you can do what you want tonight, man, but you got to put up with yourself tomorrow morning, and you got to put up with yourself for what you did tonight next week and next year and 5 years from now. And every single one of your actions is like that. And so in order to act properly, you have to sacrifice the impulsive gratification and the easy way out that's characteristic of the moment, and extend yourself across time so that you are acting in concert with the highest interest of yourself in the broadest possible range of contexts. And that's what it means to be an adult. And you do exactly the same thing with other people. In a relationship, in a marriage, you're not just who you say you are from moment to moment. You have to negotiate very carefully with your wife or with your husband on an ongoing basis, every week, every moment in some sense, while you're communicating, to understand not only how you can get what you need and you want, which may be necessary and important, especially in the long run, because you have to treat yourself properly, but so that you can do that in a way that your partner can also get what he or she needs and wants, in a way that makes both of you more likely to get what you need and want over the long span, and more so than you would get if you were alone. And if it wasn't the case, why would you bother with it? And then you have to incorporate children into that too, and that gets to be a more complex unity. So if there's 5 of you, well, how do you balance your individual needs and wants with that small collective? And that's the negotiation process that goes on in a family, and hopefully you do that too in the spirit of reciprocity and truth and love, and you take on that responsibility. And that's the core aspect of sacrifice, right? The great discovery of the human race. That's what sacrifice means. And you sacrifice the foolishness of yourself. You sacrifice the momentary foolishness of yourself to the highest good that you can possibly imagine. And there's nothing in that that isn't good, even though it's difficult. And that's not mere inhibition of those impulsive gratifications that, if only were allowed to be manifest fully, would set you free. Quite the contrary, you would have precisely the freedom of an extremely badly behaved 2-year-old. And that's no freedom at all, right? All that is freedom to wander in the street and get crushed by the first car that drives by. There's nothing in that that's proper. Buddha said, well, don't be too attached to things. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean deny the world. It might mean deny the world if you're too in love with the material, like with material well-being, let's say. Then your pathway to transcendence and meaning might be to abandon that, because it's constraining you. It's making you less than you could be. But the fundamental lesson, the more fundamental lesson that's underneath that is, don't let what you are stop you from being what you could be. Right. And so then the question is, well, what do you identify with? Do you identify with what you are? Then you're a tyrant. Do you identify with chaos? Because that's the opposite of order, say. Then you're nihilistic. Well, you don't identify with either of those. You know that they're both necessary. You know that you have to live with both of them, but you identify with the capacity to continually transcend what you are. And then you seek out error. That's what humility is. It's like, I'm error-ridden. It's like, so I want to put myself in a situation where I can discover one of my errors, hopefully not in a way that's going to knock me completely out of the game, right? I want to seek out a challenge. I want to find out where my limits are. I want to find out where there's not enough of me yet. And I want to do that in a way that's engaging, because, you know, you can wear yourself out fighting dragons, obviously. You can exhaust yourself completely, and that's not helpful. You know, one of the things I learned, for example, when I was coaching
when I was coaching lawyers, these were people who had very high-end careers, and so they had an infinite workload. No matter how much they worked, flat out, there was always way more work that they should do. It's a very difficult thing to learn to manage. And so they were exhausting themselves, and I said, well, you know, you have to work less per day. It's like, well, no, that's not happening. I can't do that. And so what I learned over time was, okay, so this is what you have to do. Every 3 months you have to block off 4 days and go have a vacation. And you have to plan that in advance so it's in your calendar so that your secretary doesn't book your time. And then you need that because you have to recuperate enough so that you can work as hard as you're going to work. And of course they were nervous about that. And I said, well, look, we can calibrate this. Let's keep track of your billable hours over the next year and see if they increase or decrease. Because I bet you if you take more time off, you'll actually have more billable hours. You'll actually have your cake and eat it too. You'll get to have a vacation and you'll be more productive. And that inevitably, that was what happened. And so that's a matter of calibrating the game properly, right? You want to play a game that you can play today, but also one that you can play next week and next month. We're not talking about, you know, your career this week. We're talking about you having a career that lasts 30 years, that doesn't kill you, that doesn't make you hate yourself or the job, that doesn't make you bitter, that doesn't wear you to a frazzle. So it has to be optimized. And so I think that you can, in fact, decide to take on the load that's optimally meaningful if you want, and then you get to have your cake and eat it too. You're on the pathway to continual incremental improvement. You only have to burn off a feather at a time instead of having the whole bloody thing burst into flames. But it's a constant source of renewal. And there's an idea that to be renewed, you have to drink the water of life, right? That's an old mythological idea. And what's the water? The water of life, chaos is water. Water is chaos. Water is what washes away too much order. And to stay continually, let's say, refreshed by the water of life is to take on exactly the right amount of chaos to make sure that your garden is properly nourished. And I think meaning is actually the marker of that. In the story of Adam and Eve, God is not least. And this is God as character, or God as model for ritual emulation, or God as central narrative figure. That's another way of thinking about it. God is the spirit that you walk with when you're not self-conscious in a well-tended garden. Okay, so why do you have a garden? Precisely so you can do that. To forget about yourself for a minute, to engage in the apprehension of something balanced and beautiful, a walled garden, the proper integration of culture and nature, and the proper apprehension in that situation frees you of your self-conscious burden. And so for a moment you enter that transcendent state that's associated with the Edenic paradise. So that's God in that story. Later in the story of Adam and Eve, God is the spirit that calls you to conscience when, like Adam and Eve, you've bitten off more than you can chew. In the story of Cain and Abel, God is the spirit of conscience that calls to you when you've made improper sacrifices and are facing the consequence of your unwillingness to go all in on your life. In the story of Noah, God is the spirit that calls to you, if you're wise, when trouble is coming and you determine to batten down the hatches. In the story of Abraham, God is the spirit that calls the overprotected and unwilling, despite their resistance, out into the adventure of their life. In the story of Moses, God is the spirit that calls to those who are oppressed and in slavery to free themselves from the grip of tyranny, whether it's their psychological tyranny or whether it's the tyranny of the state. And so all of those stories point to an underlying transcendent unity of character, let's say, which is the proper model for worship and celebration and ritual emulation that's united, that's the antithesis to the, let's say, darker and more multiplicitous spirits that might rule the world. And part of the religious enterprise is the elaboration and understanding, and then the incorporation, ingestion, and modeling of that spirit in your own life. And to the degree that you do that, you do what the Logos did at the beginning of time in Genesis. You use truth, truthful speech, guided, let's say, by love, to confront the transforming horizon of the future, the chaos and potential of the transforming horizon of the future, and turn it into the habitable order that is good. And that's a manifestation of the image of God that man and women are made in.
And Beauty and the Beast, I think, is the best Disney film, all things considered. It's very witty. I like the music. It doesn't moralize. It's got a great female hero. It is an investigation into ideal femininity and the redemptive power of femininity. And then one of the things that's so subtle about Beauty and the Beast is that you have Gaston, and Gaston isn't a monster, but he is, which is why Beauty doesn't like him. He's got everything. He's tall, and he sings that. I've got everything. Look at me. I'm tall. I'm handsome. I'm strong. I'm brave. He's all persona, like he's all surface. And he isn't the monster, because the beast is the monster, but the beast is real. And Beauty can see that, and she turns away from the narcissistic persona and pursues the redeemable beast. And if you don't see that that's how human beings interact with each other, you're not looking. And women are that. And the woman wants the redeemable beast because the redeemable beast has the virtues of the beast. And if you want someone to protect you and your infants from beasts, you need someone with the virtue of the beast. And so, but he has to be redeemed, because as a beast, he's a beast. You want a beast in your house? It's like, no, it's not. That's not good. He has to be civilized beast. That's what I'm encouraging young men to be. Civilized beasts.
Do you remember your process of integrating your shadow?
Oh, definitely. I definitely remember that. I think the best practice is to try to not lie. Try to stop lying. Listen to your words. Listen. Feel them. Feel them. Are they the right words? Do you believe this? Do you believe what you're saying? Is it true as far as you're concerned? And then you might find that you have something true to say, but you're afraid to. Okay, then there's a place for integration of the shadow, because hopefully you can be monstrous enough to say what you believe to be true. And so that means there's a combativeness in some sense in that. And so if you can't do that, so maybe you don't say what's true because you want to be a persona, you want to be nice, you want to appeal to people, you want to be popular, whatever it is you're pursuing. You're going to do it in a manipulative way, and you subjugate your truth to that. That's not helpful. I mean, well, you're pursuing the road of Gaston in some sense. I mean, he's popular in the village, and he's got a mob behind him, and what's not to like? And that's what he says. But Beauty she's wiser than that. I started paying attention to how my words made me feel psychologically when I was about 23. I really started to pay attention, and I learned that was worth paying attention to, and I swore that I would strive to not lie, to say what I believe to be the case. And so that was part of the reason why my lectures were popular, say at Harvard and then at the University of Toronto. And before this explosion of notoriety, there was some movement in that direction. I had posted my Maps of Meaning lectures online. That TV station in Toronto had done a 13-part series on the Maps of Meaning course, because of the somewhat remarkable student response to the course, because the typical response in the student evaluations, the typical comment was, this course changed the way I look at everything.
If and when tragedy strikes either of us, I hope that one of us is standing when it blows past. And that there's a harshness about that that's unbelievably cruel, because you say, well, if my mother died, I could live Well, what kind of monster are you exactly? The death of your mother doesn't do you in? Well, it turns out that being a monster is the right thing. So, and that's a rough thing to learn. But it's necessary to learn. You know, because it also makes you, you know, at some point, for example, as you get older, by the time you're in your mid-20s, something like that, you should start having a relationship with your parents that's approximately one of peers. And you can tell if you have that, so here's a little trick you can use. So you have parents, obviously, they have friends. You probably care what your parents think, I would imagine. Do you care what their friends think of you? And the answer to that is, well, not nearly as much. And so then I would say, well, why do you care what your parents think of you then? They're the same people. You know what I mean? It's just luck of the draw that your parents are someone else's kids' friends. They don't think the same way about them that you do. Well, that's where you see that you have a projection. Right? If by the time you're 30, if what your parents think of you matters more than what, say, a random set of their friends think of you, then you've still got your parents confused with God. That's one way of looking at it. You've still got them confused with an archetype, and you're still a child. And you might think, well, it's pretty damn rude not to think about what your parents think of you anymore, not to care. It's like, yeah, it's kind of rude, but maybe you'll be useful for them when they get old. And that's a much better form of caring. It's like you're going to be independent enough and strong enough and detached enough so that when the power dynamic shifts, which it will, that you'll be the person that can carry things forward. Well, you can't do a better thing for them than that, right? That's the best of all possible outcomes for your parents. Sisyphus, and Nietzsche said of Sisyphus, if I remember correctly, that one has to imagine him happy. Well, if there's a rock at the bottom of the hill, then you might as well push it up the hill. And if it rolls back down, well, then you've got something else to do, don't you? You can push the damn rock back up the hill. And there's no shortage of rocks to push up the hill, and that's what we're built for anyways. And so let's go out and like push some damn boulders up the hill, and then maybe we could have enough self-confidence and enough respect for ourselves that we wouldn't have to turn to hatred and revenge and try to take everything down, because I think that's the alternative. So he's not weak. That's one thing you can say about him. The same idea represented there, right? That's Atlas, who voluntarily takes the world on his shoulders. It's like the idea of Christ taking the sins of the world on his shoulders. It's exactly the same notion, which is the notion that you should be able to recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity and take responsibility for it, because that's what that means. And the thing that's so interesting about that is that if you can recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity, you will instantly have a hell of a lot more respect for yourself than you did before you did that. Because there's some real utility in knowing that you're a monster. Now, and just because you're a monster doesn't mean you have to be a monster, but it's really useful to know that you are one. So, one of the things that Jung knew, and this is something that I find so amazing about his writings, I think something that really distinguishes him, for example, from Joseph Campbell, who talked about following your bliss, is like Jung said very clearly that the first step to enlightenment is the encounter with the shadow. And what he meant by that was, everything horrible that human beings have done was done by human beings, and you're one of them. And so if you don't understand that, and to understand that really means to know how it was that you could have done it, and that's a shattering thing. To try to imagine that, to try to imagine yourself as someone who's engaged in medieval torture, to see how you could in fact do that. You're never the same after you learn that. But being never the same after learning that is unbelievably useful, because when you understand that that's what you're like, then you're a whole different creature. And I don't think, and this is something I did learn from Jung, is that you cannot be a good person until you know how much evil you contain within you. It is not possible. And it's partly because you just don't have any potency. Like, if you're just naive, if you're just nice, if you'd never hurt anyone, you'd never hurt a fly, you don't have the capability for any of that, why would anyone ever take you seriously? You're a domestic animal at best. And it's a very strange thing, because you wouldn't think that the revelation of the capacity for evil is a precondition for the realization of good. But I believe, first of all, why would you be serious enough to even attempt to pursue the good unless you had some sense of what the consequence was of not doing it? You have to be serious about these sorts of things. It's not the game of a child, right? It's the game of a fully developed adult. And I learned this in part when I had little kids. I wrote a chapter for my new book called Never Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And why was that? And I wrote that after I knew I was a monster. And I thought, I'm going to make sure I like my kids. I'm going to make sure they behave around me so that I like them. Because I'm way bigger than them. And I'm way more cruel than they are. And I've got tricks up my sleeve that they cannot even possibly imagine. And if they irritate me, I will absolutely take it out on them. And if you don't think that you're the sort of person that would do that, then you are the sort of person who is doing it.